It was so noisy. It was very loud.
You never knew what was going to happen. It was really scary.
Couldn't be a normal kid.
Going to school every morning was really difficult.
I remember times falling asleep to it and then waking up and thinking about it.
You didn't know what was going to happen while you were away.
I couldn't bring my friends home.
Sitting in school, it was really hard to concentrate in school itself.
You just got to tell someone.
Life doesn't have to be like that.
But if no one knows, then you're just making it worse for yourself.
I could hear my daughters crying in the next room with only a few feet away.
These domestic violence cases are just a few of tens of thousands that occur each year for children. When their innocence in childhood are robbed from them, their lives are filled with stress and fear. It is important to realize domestic violence not only affects its victims, it affects the whole community. I understand firsthand how domestic violence can affect a child, a family, and a community, because I am a survivor of family violence too. Having come from a domestic violence situation, and really that was all I knew for the first 18 years of my life, it didn't really dawn on me until I got to be about the age of 12 that things weren't quite right in our home. In school, I learned to work much harder. I figured that if I could prove myself to my father, if I could prove that I was a good person, a good student, with a strong work ethic, he would love me more, and he wouldn't hit me anymore, and he wouldn't call me names anymore. And so it really just made me work harder. And that was all fine and good, but it really didn't help in his eyes. The key to helping children in the grips of a violent home is understanding what domestic violence is, how it affects children, and the steps you can take to assist a child. Mark Wynn, a retired police officer with the Nashville Police Department, and Sarah Buell, an attorney and professor at the University of Texas School of Law, are internationally known experts in the field of domestic violence and are themselves domestic violence survivors. Their experience and knowledge will help you understand the dynamics of domestic violence and how you can help.
Dr. David Adams, who's run a batterers intervention program in Boston for about 25 years, defines domestic violence as a planned pattern of coercive control. And I've come to realize that that's a much more accurate description of what is happening.
I would tell people about domestic violence that it's a crime that crosses every socioeconomic level. It's in every community. There's more of it than you know. It's the most committed, least reported crime in the country. It's a crime of power and control. It's a crime that has an immediate impact on families and a long-lasting impact on families and an even longer impact on society. It takes millions of life years out of our society every year through death and destruction. Domestic violence is a large problem, not only for law enforcement, for health care, for social services. It's become one of the biggest issues that we deal with in law enforcement today. A police officer will spend a third or half of their career investigating domestic violence cases. So it is a very, very big issue for the criminal justice system. And I'll have to say this, though. After 17 years of working in this field, after living in it for 10, we still don't know the true numbers. The Department of Justice, in their latest report, says around half of the victims report. So if you've got a community with 10,000 domestic violence cases, double that number, and you'll probably get a pretty good idea of the number of domestic violence cases in your community.
The Office of Management and Budget tells us that domestic violence costs American businesses between $3 and $5 billion a year. So we know in higher costs in general criminal activity, and certainly in the workplace, it's very expensive.
We know now that there is an engine that runs domestic violence, and it's called power and control.
Many of us were under the misimpression early on that drugs and alcohol caused domestic violence. So when an abuser came in who was a drug addict or addicted to alcohol, we thought if we send them to AA or NA, maybe an inpatient program if it was really bad, then we had cured the problem. But we ended up with all these sober batterers and came to learn that these were people who had two separate problems. They needed to address their chemical dependency, but separately go to a batterers intervention program, not anger management, since it's not about anger, but someplace that would insist that they be held accountable for the abuse of the power and control.
There are myths about domestic violence. Let me dispel some of them. I've heard this many times. Victims stay in domestic violence because they're sadomasochistic. They like to be abused. Believe me, this is not the case at all. To say that would be similar to saying that a POW stays in a prisoner of war camp because they like the atmosphere, they like the prison guards, they want to stay there longer. That's not true. You are, in the same sense, a POW if you live in a home filled with domestic violence. The wire and the machine guns aren't there, but they don't have to be. All that has to be there is your belief that you're going to be attacked or abused, and that keeps you contained.
Some members of the community think, well, that's the family's problem. I don't have to worry about it. They need to get some help for that violence, but it doesn't affect me. We know that the way we treat our children determines the level of crime in our communities. That if children are growing up in a violent home and are learning it's okay to use violence to get what you want, they have a much higher likelihood of becoming a juvenile delinquent and acting out that violence on others around them.
Leaving a violent relationship is not an event. It's not just going to happen one day when I walk in as a cop and say, you're in danger. It takes a process. Part of that process is a caring community that has professionals in it who understand not only why victims stay, but why offenders offend, and hold offenders accountable for that. The victim is where we need to focus our assistance, and the offender is where we need to focus our accountability.
It's a common misconception that domestic violence only occurs among poor people or with people of color, but that is certainly not what we are finding in communities, for example, that practice mandatory arrest so that the officers will arrest any time they have reason to believe domestic violence has occurred, such as in Seattle or Minneapolis, Duluth. Many of those communities report once they arrest based on visible injuries and the belief the crime has occurred, that they arrest just as many proportionally high income, white, middle income, really of every race, culture, socioeconomic status.
To say that men and women fight minimizes this crime. To say that it's just another disagreement, it's another argument between a husband and wife. If you believe that, then you really don't understand the issue of domestic violence, because domestic violence destroys families.
In the early 1980s, Dr. Lenore Walker proposed the cycle theory of violence, in which she suggested that there is first a tension-building phase, then the violent incident, and then what she characterized as a honeymoon phase. And in her research, about 48 to 49% of victims said that they experienced this at some point in the abusive relationship. But I think it's very important to point out that many victims do not ever experience a honeymoon phase, that they may not be aware of any tension building. The violence appears to come out of nowhere. And also that with the same perpetrator, there are different patterns. One time the abuser may show that he's losing his temper, that he's upset, that he's about to become violent. The next time there is no warning. So many of us take issue with the term honeymoon phase. We would prefer it characterized as apology or contrition phase, in which the abuser professes to be sorry. And we think some perpetrators probably are sorry for what they did. However, from working in the courts for 24 years, it's my belief most of them are sorry they got caught, but not sorry they committed the violence, and they would do it again in a heartbeat if they thought they could get away with it.
But let me sort of draw it for you. We know that it starts out with tension building. We know that it escalates to an assault, and we know that after an assault, in many cases, there is a honeymoon phase where the offender is remorseful and they ask for forgiveness, and that's when the flowers and candy and the crying and all of those things happen, but it's all false. This is a manipulative criminal offender who's taught to be remorseful so they won't be reported to the police.